My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Black Women Taught Us, an intimate history of Black feminism. This is a book we've been really hype about since we first saw it listed. And so we're really honored to get to celebrate it in this manner. We're joined by the author, Dr. Jenn M. Jackson, in conversation with our favorite librarian, Forrest Evans. And this event is co-hosted by our friends at Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history. So if you're coming because of the library, thank you so much for being here. So a little bit about Dr. Jackson. She's been known to bring historical acuity to some of the most controversial topics in America today. Now, in their first book, Jackson applies their critical analysis to the questions that have long energized their work. Why has Black women's freedom fighting been so overlooked throughout history? And what has our society lost because of our refusal to engage with our forestrugglers' lessons? This book is a love letter to those who have been minimized and forgotten. This collection repositions Black women's intellectual and political work at the center of today's liberation movements. So I want to start by introducing Forrest Evans. Forrest is a licensed Atlanta-based librarian working in sports and tech for Warner Brothers Discovery. The Low Country native is committed to combating undereducation, fighting for gender equity, and systemic patriarchy that brings joy to her day. And the superheroine is known as the favorite librarian on social media, where she provides an array of queer books and resources. Forrest is the newest member of the board of directors of the Atlanta Pride Committee and also serves on the steering committee for the Atlanta Pride Run. She is also the logistics coordinator for Gay Magazine. A published poet and creative, her work can be found in Pen and Brush, Lavender Review, Lesbian Poetry and Art, TQ Review, a journal of trans and queer voices, and the Apogee Journal, to name a few. So welcome, Forrest. We always love getting to work with you. Thank you for being here. And of course, the person of the hour is Dr. Jenn M. Jackson. They is an award-winning professor of political science at Syracuse University and a columnist for Teen Vogue, where they write the popular Speak On It column that explores how today's social and political life is influenced by generations of racial and gender disorder. A queer, gender flux, androgynous Black woman, Jackson primarily researches in Black politics with a focus on Black feminism, racial trauma and threat, gender and sexuality, and social movements. The book we are celebrating tonight, Black Women Taught Us, is their very first book.
That's right.
Yes. So we are so glad. We love to launch books. That's our favorite thing.
Yes.
Helping birth your artistic baby into the world
yes.
is really the way we take it very seriously. So thank you for gracing Charis with this opportunity. I want to let folks know they can ask questions at any time. You can also shout out where you're watching from in the chat. And be loud in the chat. We appreciate you. But I'm gonna get out of here and let our favorite librarian take it away.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ER. Oh,
wow.
Man.
It's so official.
Yes. Before we start, happy Black Month.
Child, it's been incredible. It has been incredible. And I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad we are in this conversation. I'm so glad to be here with Charis Books and to be talking with folks who have a deep love and regard for our written word. So I'm full. What an incredible Black History Month. What an incredible year. So I'm over the moon. How are you doing?
Oh, yes. I was hoping we could do a check-in before we dig in. I am thriving. This book has been restorative work for me.
I love that.
There's some questions I really want to hear your insight and your response to. So really, this title is literally a physical and emotional hug from a well-seasoned Black aunt, sister, cousin, mother, so many friendships, but many of us have yet to experience that, especially been afforded a safe, brave space. Many of your personal stories. Can you walk us through the development and how you handcrafted this book, your first title? specifically?
Yes, I love that. So what I want to start with also is what I've done in every single one of these talks, which is just taking a moment to really ensure that we are centered and grounded and thinking about what the purpose of this book was and is, which is to honor my ancestors, my elders, my foremothers, and forestrugglers who brought me into this world and who have raised me and saved my life over and over again. So this conversation will 100% center them. I'm a product of their labor and of their work. So to answer your question, I think it actually comes out in the first few sentences of the book, right? Because I start off the book talking about my mother and my aunts, my extended kinship network of aunts who are of no blood relationship to me, who would come to my home every Wednesday evening for choir rehearsal. My mother is a incredible gospel singer, and my family, they're all singers. We're all singers, and this was a tradition in our family. And on those evenings, I was always excited, and I talk about this in the book, because I would have an opportunity to talk to so many of the Black women in my family about kind of innocuous things, and one of the stories I tell in the book is about my Aunt Barbara, who was not a blood relation to me, who taught me how to cook chicken properly, right? She taught me how to make sure I cooked it until there was no red at the bone, right? You poke it until it comes out clear, right? And I was inspired to write this book because for a very long time I had this deep longing, which I think also comes through in the book, especially in that first chapter, to locate myself, right, to find myself amongst my people. And growing up as a queer-bodied Black girl, 6'4", by the time I was 12 years old, and gender queer, and at times not really knowing what my gender was, but also feeling very tethered to these Black women in my household who were singing gospel music. I didn't know where I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know who I was or where I belonged. And so I always knew I belonged with these women, right? I knew I belonged with my grandmother, who told me when I was a young girl, she said, people like us, we're going to always be lonely. So you find the people that love you and you love them back. And that's in the book, right? These are the lessons that I got from these women very, very early. And they held me, they took care of me as I encountered this anti-Black, misogynistic, white supremacist world that tried to annihilate me over and over and over again. So this book is a love letter for that reason, right? Because it is a reflection of the ways that I've had to go back and say thank you, and I'm sorry, and yes, I'll do better, right? Because I owe those women so much. I owe those women, those queer folk, those polyamorous folk, those folks who were living queerly and differently, right, in my life. I owe them so much, and I'm so grateful for the example that they showed me, so I knew the possibility for how I could live a little bit freer.
Oh, wow. Being in community is not only essential, a theme that you have, but not only in the home that cultivated you and the voices of also oral history you've mentioned, but something that you also mentioned, I got a hint on, that you just spoke about polyamory. You shared some intimate, personal stories of non-monogamy and polyamory.
Sure did.
The Black church and Christianity is at the heart of many Black communities all around the world. But in chapter 11, you stated, as a Black, queer, androgynous, gender flux woman who at times sees no gender at all, you
That's
love
right.
expansively.
That's right.
And you also mentioned, I subscribe to the idea that love is not a limited resource. How can readers utilize non-monogamy as a site for building community and healing?
Okay, chapter 11. You better cite. Okay, so this is beautiful, right? I'm so excited you brought this up. This is something no one's asked me yet. So I write about non-monogamy in chapter 11 when I'm talking about bell hooks, right? And really, it's people are like, how do you end up mixing this conversation? Because people think it's all about love, right? And it's not all about love. It's actually a chapter about death. This chapter I wrote after Bell Hooks passed away. This was a chapter that originally was not in the book. And I wrote it after my grandmother passed away during COVID. She passed away in 2021. And my dear friend Lauren Berlant passed away, and Bell Hooks passed away. And it was this kind of, back to back experience of loss of these folks who had been people who were such critical, like guiding lights in my life, but who I also felt that I had taken for granted. I felt that I had not acknowledged properly, properly acknowledged their role in my life when they were here. So I wrote that chapter from a place of guilt and a place of shame. And I brought polyamory into it because I realized that we are taught these forms of love that are just so limited. And it's not just monogamy, right? We are taught these ways of loving Black women in particular that are often violent and repressed. We know we don't love people if they seem like they're not a squeaky wheel. You got to look sad or down or depressed for us to actually offer you compliments and care. We wait until people are sick to actually check in on their bodies and their actual health. And I realized that I had actually participated in some of that during the COVID crisis. This really came flooding to the forefront for me as I kept losing these aunts and these people in my life who were not necessarily blood relation, but some of them were, including Auntie Barbara, the person I was writing about at the beginning of the book. She passed away during COVID. And I was sitting with this immense loss. And with my life as a polyamorous person, I've never been monogamous. I've never understood what it means to only have romantic feelings toward one person, because that's never happened for me. It's just never existed in my body. So I've never been monogamous, but also I've never understood a scenario where I would be relegated to a world where I'm only allowed to love one Black person romantically. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine it. I love Black people so much that for me, it's impossible, especially Black women, to be like, well, just this one. It doesn't make sense to me. But what it also doesn't make sense, the other reasons why it doesn't make sense, is because if we really believe that love should be liberating, like Bell Hooks tells us, that it should be an act that we choose each day, that it's something we do actively, there should be no scenario, right, where then love feels like we are being placed in any form of bondage or harm or abuse, or where we have to live small, or we have to reduce ourselves, or like I talk at the beginning of the book about Melissa Harris Perry's concept of the crooked room, where we have to fit ourselves into another space that we don't actually belong in. So what I was realizing in that chapter about polyamory and about death, actually, is that in that moment when I was analyzing how I had loved these folks, these queer folks, these women folks in my life, I realized that I had fallen short of a standard I was setting for myself, right? That I had set a standard for myself to love expansively beyond these containers and categories that were pre-existing. So beyond the containers that said that you have to love Black women this way, and you have to love grandmothers and elderly folk this way, and kin who are not your blood that way, right? I had in some way subconsciously participated in that. So really me talking about polyamory in that chapter is me holding myself accountable to what I've been professing to be all this time, right? To apply polyamory and the loving expansively, not just to romance, right? But to kinship. And that's what I'm hoping folks will understand, right? That this concept of polyamory is to push us beyond the idea that we can only share intimacy with children and with romantic partners and with people who have blood relationships with us, right? Because Lauren Berlant was a dear friend of mine. And the pain that I felt when Lauren Berlant left this side was a real pain.
Mhm.
But I was socialized to treat that differently. And that's not okay to me. That's not liberating, right? That's a form of self-abuse that I refuse to participate in.
A part of, if fairly stated, part of your writing was a contribution to your healing and
Yeah,
processing grief of loss. You
right.
know, if we were to stay in chapter 11, your vulnerability with sharing your story about your late friend Lauren made me
Yeah.
feel seen. You metaphorically described how the unanswered email haunts you.
Hmm.
A testament for a lot of Black women and queer folk with what haunts us by our choices or unaddressed trauma or the
Mm.
that you mentioned of what we believe and how we can
Hmm.
receive or give it. You know, my
Yeah.
question is, how can readers address the same areas of
Mm.
impact and loss and healing without feeling like their vulnerability will be weaponized or misunderstood?
Mm. What a beautiful question. I think that's such a great question, because people ask me all the time, like, how are you so publicly vulnerable?
Yeah.
And I think I'll go to the text, right? And I actually won't go to chapter 11. I think this is something that really is answered in some ways by the Fannie Lou Hamer work, right? The work that Fannie Lou Hamer does, and the way she shows up in community, right? So what we know about Fannie Lou is that Fannie grew up poor, and Fannie spent her whole life fighting on behalf of poor folk. Um, Fannie was subjected to what's called a Mississippi appendectomy, where they sterilized her without her permission. And she was beaten by police officers, and humiliated during those beatings in a sexualizing manner. There were repeated incidences where her body and her vulnerabilities were exploited
Mhm.
to diminish her, and for the purposes of making her feel small. And I write about Fannie in the context of respectability politics,
Mm.
um, because Fannie was unrespectable. And there is this kind of classist milieu, right, of, proper behavior for the Negro woman,
Mhm.
that I don't subscribe to. And I think that's the answer, right? When we talk about vulnerability being exploited, right? Audrey already taught us that if we have no shame, if we have no regret, nothing we've experienced or done can be used against us, right? And if we believe that, and I fundamentally do, um, then all we need is Black feminist courage for our vulnerabilities to not be exploited and used against us. I live my life very publicly. And I have privacy. People ask me, do you have privacy? I absolutely have a private life. I have an inner life, right?
Mhm.
However, I choose to heal in public, just as Fannie Lou did, just as Audre Lorde did. And
Mm.
I choose to heal in public because I choose to push against and challenge the narrative that suggests that A, Black people aren't healing, and B, that Black feminist healing has to be traumatic and broken down and
Okay.
ugly and dark, right?
Mhm.
I am healing in joy. I am healing in a state of grief that also brings me to these places that are gentle and soft. I am healing in community. I
Mm.
am healing among people who remind me and affirm me with me every day that they are here for me, and they are Black, and most of them are women, and most of them are queer.
Mm.
Many of them are trans, many of them are disabled. So I heal in public because my vulnerabilities allow me a certain intimacy with my community where I am safe. I don't care what internet trolls think. Kiese Layman taught me a long time ago. It don't matter what words you use, they gonna call you a nigga anyway.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm not worried about them, right?
Uh-huh.
But I'm accountable to my community. right? And part of my accountability is that I will be vulnerable, and that I will be honest, and that I will be intimate in places where it is safe and where we can potentiate one another. And I'm blessed, right? I'm lucky in that I have people. You are one of my people, right? I have a beautiful extended network of people who step in and who fill the gap and who I do the same for. So I think that the fear, right, of vulnerabilities being exploited stems from what Bell Hooks would call a lack of community. And I think that that's how we fix those issues, right? I don't have to worry about my vulnerabilities being exploited because my people hold me every time.
Wow. Your choice to heal publicly is just not only radical restorative, but it's a reflective journey that others can contribute to. You spoke about the importance of community with Bell Hooks. Without question, this book is an array of Black women and multiple intersections and identities, which allows all readers to be seen and heard
That's right.
effortlessly. And from the intersection of the queer spectrum to prioritizing self-care, self-advocacy, accountability is what you mentioned before with your friends' relationship, also your Aunt Barbara, but also using properly cultural narratives not as a backdrop and circulating them as a way to uplift them as well. Your title is literally a contemporary framework for radical inclusion, an
That's
element
right.
of Black feminism and
That's
women.
right.
What is kinship or community for the Black community and women, especially Black queer folk? How important is it? And for those that don't have it, what are tools or efforts or build or cultivate a community, a
I
tribe?
love that. I love that. So I love that question. And Bell has written a lot about kinship, but I think what it brings to the forefront for me is I always go to the Zora chapter, right? The Zora chapter, when I first wrote it, it knocked me off my feet because I was like, I love Zora. I love Zora. Zora wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is my favorite book of all time. I happened to pick it up when I was 11 years old in a library. Thank God for libraries. And I said, I don't know what this is, but I love this. And what I think about with Zora and kinship is I think about this Black feminist kinship, right? That chapter is, even though it's about labor, it's about the reclamation of our labor, right? Taking it back, right? That's part of what kinship is too. And I connect, Zora's story, which is in her life a pretty tragic story, right? She does all this work. She's an anthropologist, she's a writer, she's an archivist. She does all this work during the Harlem Renaissance, and she's largely shunned by her own people. Black men, I'm not going to say no names, Richard, right? Don't appreciate her work. They say it's too hood. They say it's too country. They say it misrepresents Black people because she uses African American dialect from the South. And she keeps doing her work anyway, and they kind of just leave her out of the canon. And what happens is in her lifetime, her work is not taken up. And so she's kind of destitute at the end of her life, right? She dies in poverty and is in an unmarked grave. And I remember I heard that Alice Walker is actually the person that found her. She pretended to be her niece and went around Easton and found her. And the part where she talks about being in this field, calling out to Zora, looking over this meadow. She said the grass was so high, it went up to her waist. And she had gotten to the point, it's hot outside, it's Florida, and she was kind of demoralized. She thought she wasn't going to find her. And she called out, Zora, Zora, can you hear me? And she stepped backward and stepped her foot into the grave, right where Zora was. And the first time I read that, I'm trying to tell you, tears,
Serendipitous, being guided by your inner voices, also your ancestors pushing you.
That's it. And it was so visceral to me because my grandmothers have always been so significant to me. My grandmothers helped raise me. I was raised mostly by women, and My grandmother Clara, who's my father's adoptive mother, she was my great aunt. I talk about this in the book too, finding out that she was my great aunt and not my birth grandmother. She would give me books that were very inappropriate for my age. So she would let me read, how Stella got her groove back, but I was definitely like in fifth grade, but I was reading it. I was a voracious reader.
Yes, love
She was
it.
like, just read it before your mom comes back, But she passed away when I was 17. And it was very tragic because my dad was a very troubled man. My dad was very troubled. His adoption was very tragic for him. He was the only one of his 11 or so siblings to be adopted. And he didn't know who his father was. So I became this kind of orphan when he became this orphan. I got separated from this family when he got separated from this family. And even though we knew who they were, I knew who my uncles were, I knew who my aunties were, I didn't have this connection with my cousins. And because they all got to hang out, their grandmother was someone else. And I didn't know these things until I was 11 years old when my birth grandmother passed away. So I had this very complicated relationship to kinship because my father was really on his own. And when I read that part of Alice Walker's account of finding Zora Neale Hurston, it reminded me of when I had left for college and I had to come back to the cemetery and find my grandmother. And my father and I had a very tough relationship. Again, he was a very troubled man. And I was trying to find her. I was desperate trying to find her. And I knew what cemetery she was in because my mother had sent me a obituary. And I'm just scouring and I'm crying and crying. And I remember when I finally found her, I finally found my grandmother. And I fell on that grave and I cried. And I ripped all the grass away and I ripped everything away. And I just yelled, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And that chapter on Zora did work on me, right? Because it really embodies what the Combahee River Collective said when they said, no one will fight for Black women but us.
Amen.
That's what they were talking about, right? And I realized when I read from Alice Walker how she really resurrected the work of Zora Neale Hurston. We have to credit her a lot for knowing who Hurston is today. I realized in doing this work, right? In doing this work, that is what that's what I'm seeking to do, right? That's what I'm seeking to do. And my goal with this, right, is to model the behavior, right? Not to just talk about it, but to be about it, to show it, right? I teach this. This is a class I teach. In organizing, this is what I do. I'm a political educator. In movements, I teach young people how to fight, to change systems, to abolish prisons and police, right? So to answer your question about kinship and folks who feel like they don't have it, right? This book is representative of my journey toward that. When I started that journey in chapter 1, in that introduction, I didn't have that. I felt untethered. I felt unanchored. I felt like I was blowing in the wind. I didn't know where I belonged, but I worked really hard, right? I read all the books. I went to every class. I talked to all the Black queer folk, and I wanted, right? I wanted to hold myself accountable. I wanted to do the work. I committed myself to doing the work. It's not, people think they're just going to fall backward into kinship and fall backward into community. Community is not something you just get, okay? Like it's not, you get born into a family, you build a community, you curate
That's the whole work.
a community around you. And that community is reflective of you. So who you curate is on you, right? You see what I'm saying? So that kinship is really a process that you have to engage in intentionally. And hopefully this is a bit of a lesson, right? Several lessons on how to do that.
Oh, wow. Just also in verse, just you Locating your grandmother's grave, also with your
Yeah.
father. That full circle moment. It's almost an Alice Walker moment.
It really was. It really,
So
and I was young. I was young. I was in my early 20s. I had just had my first child, and I was not politicized yet. I was not the black feminist you see before you, right? I was still the church girl trying to figure out how to come out. So it was a very visceral moment for me that came back years later and still to this day still hits me. You know what I'm saying? It was a very um it brought to me so much of the knowledge around how we could simply lose our history in just one generation. You know, one parent can pass away. And because of anti Blackness and the long arm of slavery, we can just lose our whole kind of genealogy. And it hit me so distinctly in that moment. And that's why I wanted to write about it in the book.
oh wow, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. You know, I'm glad you brought up chapter 3 was Ronan rehearsing and just reclaiming our labor. That's
Yeah,
one of my favorites, in addition to chapter 9 with Audre Lorde,
that's right.
unpack solidarity with self-care.
That's
But
right.
you practically cover every intersection, yet also addressing systematic and current issues like misogynoir and
That's right.
constant emotional labor by Black women that's not acknowledged or
That's
respected,
right.
accounted for,
Hmm.
hypersexualization of our bodies and sexualities and
That's right.
identity, and
Hmm.
intimacy that are non-sexual.
That's right.
Yet Black women have always been the trailblazers for social change and healing, like yourself.
Mm,
But why are Black women so often reduced to the margin?
mm, mm, mm. Well, you know, I mean, this makes me think about Ida, right? This makes me think about the Ida B. Wells chapter 2, and how Ida was maligned for simply telling the truth.
Mhm.
I think about this all the time. I posted something similar to this about this on Twitter about kind of being a good person and how you kind of get punished for it, right? I bring this into the book a few times where there's this phenomenon, right, where Black women, right, are asked to save folks from themselves, from problems they've created, and simultaneously not given the
Yeah.
scaffolding or the access and materials and resources to do that saving or the acknowledgement. And a lot of it is, right? Um, that the way that misogynoir works, right, is it's both systemic and extra systemic, right? So it's both the systemic processes that involve, healthcare access and reduced pay, and businesses that suggest that they're about diversity, but when they say diversity, they mean white women, that. But there's also the extra systemic factors, right? These are the ones that are also in our own communities, right? There are the behaviors of cisgender heterosexual Black men. We know that in the top 10 causes of Black women's death, one of those is homicide, and that's really linked to intimate partner violence, right?
Mhm.
So what I'm intending, right, to draw out in the book, right? I intend to tell the full story,
Mm.
right? The full story, right? So when
Mhm.
I say Black women taught us, I'm not seeking to just talk about um, the academics, right? I'm not seeking to just talk about the things that make us feel good, right? I'm also talking about the things that we also have some shame around. And unfortunately, there are some instances where Black women are relegated to those margins because we relegate ourselves there.
Mhm.
So I talk about this in the book. And I had to take this lesson, right? My best friend, Alicia, she's in the book. At one point, I was like, oh, I love Black people, Alicia. I love Black people. And I was wearing myself down to nothing. And she looked at me and she said, you love Black people. You know that includes you too. And it hit me like a ton of bricks because I realized in this loving of Black people, I wasn't holding space for a love of myself that allowed me to be safe and to grow and to have my needs met, right?
Mhm.
Unfortunately, Black women in particular, Black femme folk, Black queer folk, Black non-binary folk, especially folks who are AFAB, are socialized to accept forms of love that are harmful, but that also put us in an early grave. And I realized through writing this book and also through some of these relationships that I had while writing this book, right? That I was doing some of that to myself, right? There were some of those standards of acceptance that I had that were also problematic and rooted in my own internal misogynoir about my own ideas of my worth and who I was and what I deserved. So the questions I ask in the book, I ask this most prominently in the Audre Lorde chapter, when I ask, why do Black feminist teachers have to endure so much to teach? Why is this work putting us in an early grave? This is happening. We've seen Black women pass away at the podium as they are interim president of prominent universities. And the ceremony proceeded.
As if their works and deeds were not as credible of their own existence on earth. Let me ask you this. How do you prioritize your self-care as an organizer, a leader, a mother, a friend, a brother, so many things that you are to so many others? How do you hold that space just for you, that's sacred?
You know, I'm not going to sit here and pretend. I need to do better. But what I will say is I'm very proud of myself, right? And this book is evidence of this, right? You know, I got this book deal in around 2019, and I first had a conversation with the editor in 2018 about writing it. And at the time, I was a very different person. At the time, I was in graduate school, and I did not believe I had a book in my body. I had never been trained to believe in those kinds of things about myself. I grew up with very narcissistic parents. I was a people pleaser, and I was trained to kind of think in a way that was very reflective of a low self-worth. So even as I was accomplishing things, they were never quite impressive enough even for me. So here I was getting a PhD at the University of Chicago, and the editor is like, you know, you've been writing at Teen Vogue for several years, 4 years. Maybe you should think about a book. And I was like, who, me? You know, it was very strange. And it was after those kinds of conversations, and after I began actually really working on producing knowledge, right? So writing books and thinking about what I would write, that I started to realize, oh, you don't see it. Oh, you don't see yourself. Oh, you're not honoring yourself. And that was a really hard time and a really hard lesson. Because I had to sit with the fact that I was engaging in forms of self-sabotage because I didn't know any better, right? And I didn't feel worthy of writing this book until I knew better. So I got my shit together. I started reading a lot. I started reading a lot of books about boundaries and self-care from a trauma-informed place. I read The Body Keeps the Score, and I was like, whoa. I was like, whoa. And I learned about myself. And the same way that I employed that ambition and that drive to learn about Black feminism, I did the same thing to learn about my body and about my trauma and my history and what I was bringing with me into this project and what was true about me and what I was hearing in my head that was my voice, but what was not, right? What I had brought with me from childhood, that was someone else's voice, someone harmful, someone at church, some man on the street, you know? And now, right, after having gone through the pandemic and the closures, I realized that I also had to start working on what that meant in terms of my embodiment, right? I got to the point where during COVID-19 in 2020, I looked in the mirror and I had been in the house for so long that as a gender flux person, I started to understand that my gender was very much related to the social environment that I was in. So when I was in the home, I didn't feel gender at all. I was completely agender. And so this hair I was wearing felt like drag. So I shaved it off. I had been covering up tattoos and diminishing my piercings and all of these things I had done to kind of fit into these kind of white ways of being at this predominantly white graduate school. And I was like, this is not me. So I got a sleeve. I really worked on ensuring that the way I embodied my gender and my identity made my body feel like home, right? That this felt like a safe place. And so my self-care, while I still need to do better with we all got to do better with our diets and exercising and getting proper rest, what I will say is that I have this deep sense of peace now. I am a very grounded person. I was able to write this book from a place of deep love for myself and for my community because I was committed to honoring the words in it, right? This is not no bullshit for me. I take it very seriously. So the lessons I have in here are lessons I'm learning, and I'm also teaching myself each day, right? I'm encouraging myself each day to honor those lessons. So my self-care is a process. But I will say that it started with me making sure my body felt like home.
Feeling at home in your body is something, I think, a journey for each individual reader, myself included. But just in how you have had to unpack the work, it takes heaviness to unpack, to verbalize, in addition to asking for help during that time.
Yeah.
Let me ask this. In addition to, you mentioned reading, were there any people you leaned on during this time of writing? Because you saw yourself differently before starting the book. Now that the book is done physically here.
You know what's funny? You know what's really funny about that? So I've had a string of, I would say, not great relationships while writing this book. And I've really been thinking about that. I've been thinking about it and really sitting with that, right? A relationship that I thought was actually going to be like a lifelong relationship. This was someone I was thinking about actually marrying, ended just before the start of the book tour. And it was abrupt and it was shocking. But immediately after it happened, I felt this wave of relief. And I haven't dropped a single tear since it happened. And I have never felt so powerful. And to answer your question, I leaned on these women in ways that I think were meaningful. And I honor those relationships and I honor how those women showed up for me and the capacity they had to do so. I also leaned deeply into my community, my comrades. I have an incredible group of best friends. There are 6 of them, and they do not play about me. I'm sure there are some of them watching right now. They do not play about me. One of them just had a baby, and literally like an hour after the baby was born, she was like, "Do we have to go fight?" I was like, hey, honey, you just stay in the bed. They don't play about me. And I have this extended network of comrades who are about the work and who are serious about it. I have a spouse that I've been married to for 20 years. He is my best friend. And we have 3 children, and they are the most incredible humans I have ever met in my life. They are also humongous. They are all very tall. My daughter is 12 and she is 6'2".
Wow. She's
So I'm very blessed. I'm very blessed that I have had this very rich community. But I brought up the women I was dating because I want to be accountable, right? Because I also have slipped into that habit of leaning on romantic partners for care and not acknowledging the broader community around me that has my back.
Mm.
And I will admit that there were moments while writing this book that I did that, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sitting with that in a state of reflection now, right? And thinking about as I proceed and what my goals are in love and in life, because I want to be in love, right? I want to have romantic relationships. They are important to me.
Mhm.
However, what I don't want, right? I don't want to fall into ways of being that because they feel comfortable, I allow them to produce or reproduce harms that I'm
Yes.
used to, right? And
Mhm.
that's something I've really been sitting with, because when you with somebody and you think that you're going to be with them for the rest of your life and you break up and the first thing you feel is you
That's
got to
it.
look at yourself.
Mhm.
You've got to look at yourself and you've got to ask, what am I doing? What am I doing? So I am grateful that in that moment I had community around me to with, right? But
Mhm.
also that I reclaimed my own power, because
Mhm.
I do think that was the first time I've done that.
Really? Almost like
I
a
think
waiting
that,
moment.
mhm.
Mm.
I think that's the first time I've ever after a romantic relationship that was serious, that I've
Mhm.
ever reclaimed my power.
Mm. And in your choice, your liberation is beautiful on you.
Thank
And,
you.
your tribe and your extended network, as you mentioned, they are very blessed to have you. I can't imagine. I have 2 more questions before we bring in ER.
Yeah.
You know, this title, well, much of the work, it
Yeah.
has the same rhetoric of Wicked Flesh, Black Women,
Yes.
Intimacy, Freedom
Yes.
by Jessica Marie Johnson.
Yeah.
Feminism as well by Kindle. And it almost feels like a modern To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, right?
Okay. Uh-huh. I love it. You just be reading. I love this. I love it.
I try.
Go
But
ahead.
this book echoes literally the titans to whose shoulders you stand on.
Thank you.
What does this book mean to you now that it is done? And
Mm.
what are the readers that you envisioned while you were writing it?
Mm. Mm. Um, I'm gonna be honest with you. You know how some people say, "Oh, that's my first book. I don't like that book. I never open it." Listen, I have read this book so many times. I'm reading it again right now. I'm actually, let me see. I'm on page 5. I just restarted it.
Mm,
This is my bookmark. I am reading it again. Um, I love this book. I love this book, and it means a lot to me. It means a couple things. First, um, I tell the story in the introduction about wanting to find a Black feminist course and
mhm,
not being able to find one when I went to USC as an undergrad. I was an engineering major. And I was like, I really want to know about myself. I want to learn about myself. And I could not find a Black feminist politics course to save my life. There was one Black woman professor who I took her course. It was a race and politics course in sociology. And she was very conservative. There was actual racist things happening in class, and she did nothing. And I was like, okay. And that's in the book too. Um, and I was desperate. I was desperate. So I called my mother, and I used to read books. My mom had books all over the house, and I used to read books at the foot of her bed, and I would sometimes steal her books. And she had a lot of Alice Walker, a lot of Terry McMillan, a lot of Eric Jerome Dickey, a lot of Dean Koontz, and Danielle Steele. And
wow.
so I called her and I had asked her, what were those books I was reading? And she said, Alice Walker and Terry McMillan. And I went to Borders Books, and I was looking for the books, and I found Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. And I saw the cover with this Black woman with a bald head and this flag on her head. And I said, I don't know what this book is about, but I need to read this book.
Mhm.
And that book was so incredible and so important to me. It actually shifted the arc of my career because I was working at Disney at the time and I was desperate. I was desperate. I didn't understand why corporate America was so violent. I didn't understand why people were treating me so awful at work. And when I read about the Sapphire and the Mammy and the Jezebel and these crooked rooms,
Mhm.
I was crying into this book, crying into this book. And so I read the book, I read the bibliography, and then I started reading everything in that bibliography. And I found Bell Hooks and I found Audre Lorde. So that's how I found them. And I found Kathy Cohen, who ended up being my advisor at U Chicago for my dissertation. So it actually changed. I'm actually sitting here and this actually exists, right? Because of Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. You see what I'm saying? So for me, that's to answer your question, right? That's who I am writing this book for. I am writing this book for that person who walks in off the street and says, I am looking to see myself reflected somewhere. Here I am, a young gender bendy person, a disabled person, a Black woman, a Black queer person, and I am trying to figure out how to locate myself in this violent place that wants to annihilate me every single day. And I can't find it at school, and I can't find it at work, and I can't find it in my community. And I want them to find it here. I want them to find it here. That's who I was thinking about when I wrote this. I was thinking about Jennifer, right? Her. When she walked into that Borders, desperate. I mean, desperate. I was grinding my teeth every day at work. I was having fainting spells. It was having an actual physical impact on my body, being in that environment every single day. And that book changed my life.
Each time you open your title, I hope it feels like a hug of your inner child and your future self.
It does.
Let's get into some questions before
Okay.
we are from our audience. We have some. This is from Yolanda Brown.
Okay.
They ask, how has bringing the book to fruition allowed you to say yes to more? They also say, thanks for the work, Dr. Jenn. Thank you for the spot on interview, Forrest. Oh, well, no.
So saying yes to more. I love that question. It's a really good question. I think I want to share here that what I was telling you, Forrest, beforehand about my social anxiety. That's something that also kind of comes up in the book. I talk about being a kind of lonely, shy, and anxious child. And shy, anxious children grow up often to be shy, anxious adults. And what that has also yielded is that there's a lot of situations where I, have learned to retract. It's real easy for me to say, no, I don't need to come. Right? Oh, there's people there. I don't, it's okay, y'all. But what I will say about this book, is that when I finished it, when I really finished it in earnest, and I wrote that last word, and I sent it off that last time, I was so proud. I was so proud of what I had done. I was so proud of myself. And I was proud of myself in a different way than I had ever been before, right? I've had 3 children. I've gotten a PhD. I've had open heart surgery. I've done a lot of really big things. But this book was a feat of personal and emotional becoming. And I was deciding to give it away, right? I was deciding to give it to the world because I fundamentally believe this is the work we are supposed to do, right? I believe in the trajectory and the lineage of W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper and all of our forefathers and foremothers who did this work, our forefolks. So what I will say is it's made me a lot more courageous. It's made me a lot more courageous. I feel so much more powerful. And the shy, anxious young girl is still there. But to quote Brene Brown, you can be scared, but being brave is doing it anyway, right? And that's what I'm working on doing.
Okay, last question I think everyone else has been waiting for. The very last. After raising the bar with Black Women Taught Us,
Yeah.
what's next?
Oh, I got lots of books, y'all. It's supposed to be lit. I'm a Virgo, so y'all know I already got stuff in the all right, sorry. Okay, so I have already finished another book. I submitted it 2 weeks ago.
You are
It's
yes.
it's called Policing Blackness. It's my academic work, which is, when I tell you it's fire, it's fire. Okay. It's a work that is seeking to connect racial threat and trauma to abolition and policing in the U.S. It is another effort of mine to tell the full story of young Black Americans who encounter threat in their day-to-day lives in their own words. So I spent 4 years interviewing young Black folks all over the country, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, Houston, LA, Oakland, Boston, Philly, DC, Baltimore, Syracuse, everywhere, and talk to them about their experiences with threat. And this book is the result of those conversations, and it is in their voice, and it is just to honor their experiences. So I submitted that 2 weeks ago. That'll be out soon. I also have another book that's a continuation of that project,
We're listening.
called To Be a Radical. And it is a responsive to that book, thinking about how young Black Americans create alternative spaces outside of the white gaze, to think about new forms of politics and policies to address issues in their own communities. I have another book called The Secret Lives of Black Girls, which will likely be a young adult book that is thinking about all the conversations I had with all the Black women and Black girls in my life growing up. And there are no men who get to speak in the book. When they do speak, it's like, on Charlie Brown, when the teacher's like, it's like that. But it's all experiences I had with women growing up. So like my grandma making me top ramen and my cousin teaching me how to draw shoulders. It's all the conversations I had with women and girls growing up. So those are the main projects that I'm working on right now.
Oh, wow. I think it is safe to say we are all so proud of you, Dr.
Thank
Jenn.
you. Thank you.
I can't wait to be in conversation with you possibly again for the next one, Policing Blackness. And it's to wrap us on out. I appreciate you and your time and your joy.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for this beautiful conversation. Congratulations again, Dr. Jackson, on this and on all the stuff. I mean, I can't believe you're like, oh, just one more. Amazing. Can't wait for all of them. But tonight, I want to make sure folks know how to buy this book to support you right. So click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Black Women Taught Us: An Intimate History of Black Feminism from Charis. Really does help us when you buy event books from us. So thank you so much for doing that. If you already have your copy, obviously it makes a great gift. If you want to buy it for a fellow feminist in your life, go on and do that. If you would like to support the work of Charis Circle, I dropped that link in the chat. It really does help us when you do that. So thank you. Any other things y'all want to shout out? Anything like other appearances you have coming up or anything like that you want to let folks know about before we go?
Child, I have so many. I'll be in DC and Baltimore next weekend at Loyalty Books. I'll also be at Sankofa signing books on Saturday. I'll be at Red Emma's. And then I have a whole second leg of the book tour in Detroit, Philly, Chicago, and LA. So please go to jennmjackson.com/books. That's where all the updates will be for the tour.
Awesome. Those are all wonderful stores that you just listed out. So
I'm
folks
excited.
are in the Mid-Atlantic area. Go check those out. Forrest, you got anything you want to let folks know about?
You can definitely check me out at Favorite Librarian on Instagram and also my official website, favoritelibrarian.com. And stay tuned for season 3 of my podcast, Favorite Librarian, the podcast.
Yes.
I love it. All right. Well, thank y'all so much for being with us. Stay safe and well, and we'll celebrate future books sooner rather than later, I think.
Thank you.